Geography lives, amen? Come on, we could do better. Geography lives, amen? Amen. All right, how we doing, folks? Good. Look, tonight we have our distinguished visiting geographical scientist, Dr. Jonnell Robinson, who is Director of Community Geography at Syracuse University, also Assistant Professor of Geography at Syracuse University. And she is a very popular visiting geographical scientist. There are only 41 currently listed by the American Association of Geographers, funded by the International Geographical Honor Society. And so we're very, very happy to have Dr. Robinson to offer a lecture on points, lines, and people, connecting people in place through community geography. Dr. Robinson, would you please come on up? As with all visiting geographical scientists who have engaged in substantial field work, both qualitative and quantitative, we award the GRCC Geography Field Cap to Dr. Robinson. The field cap has been awarded to the current president of the American Geographical Society, as well as a past president of the International Geographical Honor Society. Thank you for being here. And without further ado, I ask you to begin.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for everyone who's come out tonight. I have to say, this has been a wonderful visit. For those of you who know Professor DeVivo, I'm sure you know he is quite the gregarious host. So he's been very gracious in showing me around Grand Rapids over the last few days, and I'm very grateful for him for bringing me here. Before we get started, I'm just curious to get a little bit of background on the audience. By show of hands, how many of you are students? All right, so almost all of you. And then faculty or staff members? Okay, holding court. And how many community members who are not enrolled in school? Okay, so a couple of you, great. Well, that's great, because I would like to talk directly to the students tonight and tell you a little bit about what I do in Syracuse, New York through community geography. So just to give you a little sense about what we'll talk about tonight, I'll start by giving you a little bit of an overview and background of how we decided to create Syracuse Community Geography. And that requires me telling you a little bit about what's called the Syracuse Hunger Project. And then I'll talk more about what is and why community geography, and some specifics about the opportunities and challenges as they've presented themselves for Syracuse Community Geography. So this all started about 15 years ago now. It's hard to believe that it's been 15 years. But in 2003, the director of the largest soup kitchen in Syracuse was noticing that there were a number of changes taking place in the types of people that the Samaritan Center was serving. They were noticing more children, more elderly folks, more people with college degrees and who were employed coming into the soup kitchen in need of a free meal. And he wasn't sure if this was a phenomenon that he was only experiencing at the Samaritan Center, or if this was something that was occurring across the emergency food network in Syracuse. He mentioned that the emergency food system is typically fragmented in its approach to addressing hunger. So it was difficult to know whether other organizations, such as food pantries, were experiencing some of the same changes in the demographics of the people they were serving. So he brought together a coalition of stakeholders that called themselves the Syracuse Hunger Project. And this group consisted of activists, social service providers, as well as folks like him who were serving people in the trenches day in and day out. And he brought them together so that they could take a more holistic look at what they were seeing in their city. And he decided that it might be advantageous to contact the geography department at Syracuse University, of all entities, to see what they might be able to help with. And he said he couldn't really put his finger on it, but he thought that geographers might help because they needed a view from 10,000 feet up to get a handle on what's going on the ground. So when Dale Johnson called the geography department, his phone call was received by the former chair of our department, Don Mitchell, who is known by geographers as a bit of a radical geographer. And he's very interested in social justice issues, so he thought this would be a wonderful project for our department to take on. And he said, you know, I don't know much about GIS mapping, but I do have a colleague that teaches a GIS course that might be able to help with what you're interested in seeing and doing. So he then contacted Jane Reed, a member of our department who teaches our introductory GIS course, and asked Jane if she'd be interested in undertaking a spatial analysis of hunger in her upcoming class, and to which she agreed. So the students enrolled in that semester's GIS class spent an entire semester, 15 weeks, gathering a variety of data from local stakeholders to, for the first time, show hunger in a geographical way. They mapped things like folks who received food stamps, and they were mapping data sets that traditionally weren't very publicized or shared amongst different agencies. So the maps that they created were very enlightening. They were showing a challenge in a new way. This here on our screen is the city of Syracuse. It's a small city, a little smaller than Grand Rapids. Our population is about 145,000, down from about 250,000 at our peak in the 1950s. But as a result of suburbanization and white flight and the moving of our manufacturing employment opportunities, our city's population has decreased significantly. At the same time, poverty has increased. Now we have about 35% of our residents living below the federal poverty level, and that poverty is most concentrated on our southwest and western sides of the city. The highway that bisects our city that was built in the 1950s is a major culprit of the concentrated poverty that we see. But when they mapped these new data, they saw a few different trends emerging that they weren't as aware of. First, they saw a lot of food insecurity in some of our wealthier neighborhoods that they didn't anticipate. They also noticed that the inability to provide food for one's family was much more widespread than initially was thought of. They also wanted to know about access, and mapping provided some really fresh perspectives on geographical access to the various programs that we have available in the city to help folks. So the students did things like mapping food pantries throughout the city and looking at a quarter-mile radius. Much like Grand Rapids, we have really harsh winters. So the thinking was, well, how reasonably far could someone be expected to walk to get to a food pantry, especially if they had young children in tow and it was 20 below zero. So they looked at the access, the geographical access to different services throughout the city, and noticed that there were certainly areas where we should potentially expand access to the food pantries. They also looked at things like temporal access using GIS technology. And one of the things that they found was that even in neighborhoods where we had many different programs, they all had different hours of operation. And most of those food pantries were operating during business hours, Monday through Friday. But if anyone who's ever experienced hunger knows, you can't put a time on that hunger, that what happens when you run out of food on a Saturday. So by using GIS, they were able to show some of the food pantry providers that if they were able to better coordinate their services, they would not only have better geographic access, but better temporal access as well. So throughout the Syracuse Hunger Project, there was unprecedented amounts of data sharing. They were looking at problems that the folks involved were generally aware of, but they were getting a fresh insight. Looking at intractable community challenges through the lens of geography was revealing new information, new approaches, and new solutions. And not only that, the act of getting together with a coalition of stakeholders to make these maps was also very rewarding to those who were involved. They saw unprecedented data sharing, turf wars amongst not-for-profit organizations seemed to subside for a bit while they all strategically thought about how they would change the ways in which they would approach the problems. And throughout the Hunger Project, folks started to say, you know, this seems like a very useful approach. Wouldn't it be nice if the university created a full-time position where the person could help whatever nonprofit in their endeavors to improve the community, could go and use this as a resource. And that's when my position was created in 2005. So we employed many of the lessons that we learned from the Syracuse Hunger Project to Syracuse Community Geography. So what exactly is community geography? It's something that is new within the discipline of geography. Although we have a long tradition of doing applied research, we've never called it community geography. So we've had to come up with our own definition to really state what it is that we're doing. And we liken it to an opportunity for academics who are traditionally trained in things like geospatial technologies and a variety of qualitative and quantitative methods, working in partnership with community organizations and residents to engage in action-oriented geographic research and pedagogy. So what do I mean by action-oriented? Well, it's not just about studying these various phenomena and coming up with a summary of what we're finding, but it's about finding solutions and figuring out what we'll do with the new information that's produced. Do we need new programs? Do we need better coordinated services? Do we need to advocate for policy changes at the local level or the state level? It also involves a participatory process. And what I mean by that is engaging the community partners in the research as active participants. Traditional research and scholarship is conducted by those who are trained in academic institutions. But we want our community partners to participate along the way with us because we feel that by participating in these types of processes, skills and capacity building is achieved, but also knowledge is built and communities are empowered to make change. So in that sense, knowledge is co-produced by traditionally trained academic scholars and community members. And what do I mean by the community? Community can often be a nebulous term that has negative connotations. Community is exclusive as well as it's inclusive. But we wanted it to really broadly include community groups that could benefit from using spatial analysis as an approach to understanding community problems, but that lack the capacity to undertake their own investigations. So this most often includes grassroots and community-based organizations, local service agencies that represent marginalized segments of the population, and local governmental offices. Most of the time, our projects address social disparities in community settings across multiple scales. But not all of our projects are social justice oriented. One of my favorite projects that we did a couple of years ago was a historical GIS project on the history of beer making in Syracuse. So I thought that would resonate with the Grand Rapids crowd. We, too, at the turn of the 20th century, had many breweries in our community, and my students worked with me for the first time to map out where those were and do some analysis on the impact that they had on the city at the 20th century turn. Community geography builds on a variety of frameworks and methodologies found not only in geography, but in disciplines such as sociology, community development, urban planning. And we employ some of the same methodological approaches as feminist scholars and planners who use participatory planning. And we use mixed methods and mixed media. So most of the projects that I engage with don't simply rely on GIS mapping, but involve qualitative research as well, interviews, observation, conducting focus groups, to really get a sense of the lived experience of the community members with which we work. The tangible products of the types of work that we do tend to be reports and presentations and recommendations that include both the data itself, creating new data sets, for example, and also new analyses. Our projects tend to be all grassroots driven. As a scholar, I'm very unlike most of my peers who define their area of research and spend a career investigating one or two topics. 100% of the research projects that I work on are brought to me by community-based organizations who have a specific concern and need assistance in conducting that research. All of the projects are collaborative. We work arm in arm with nonprofit service providers, public agency representatives, scholars, and activists. Co-production of knowledge is really important in that sense. I'm not an expert in all of the topics that I engage in. I have a set of methodologies that I know how to employ, and I know how to work my way through a research process. But it's my colleagues in the community who are the content experts. And so in that way, we're on an equal playing field, and that we each are bringing our own skills and knowledges to our projects. And that makes such a difference. Traditionally, research is performed on people and not with people. And folks are disempowered through this process. But we feel that working arm in arm with our community partners builds empowerment. Now, of course, community geography didn't emerge in a vacuum. Geography as a discipline has a long tradition of doing practical and applied research. And many human geographers, past and present, have strong social justice orientation. Community geography is defined and also influenced by radical geography, critical GIS, public participation GIS, and publicly engaged scholarship. And I want to talk just for a minute about each of these influences. Critical cartographers have studied maps for years and years, and they find they're socially constructed, right, and expressions of power. That historically maps have been used to colonize and conquer and are primarily created by white men. Those who engage in critical cartography are interested to use maps for different purposes, to show the alternative viewpoints. Counter-cartographers seek to use maps to tell these different stories of the oppressed. Focusing on topics such as social deprivation, poverty, and hunger, community geography is influenced by radical geographers such as Bill Bunge. And Bill Bunge is one of my heroes. He was a geographer who worked primarily in the 1960s and 70s in the Detroit area with members of the community, mostly youth in the inner city, to produce maps that sought to expose social and racial injustices. This is one of the maps that students working with Bill Bunge created in the 1970s. And if you can't see the label, it says, "Where commuters run over black children on the Point's downtown track." So he used maps to shock and to tell different stories, to tell the story of those who have been oppressed and marginalized in society. Community geography is also influenced by the People's Geography Project, which was an initiative spearheaded by many radical geographers in the 80s and 90s with the mission of making geography more relevant to the community and people at large. They sought to popularize and make even more relevant and useful to ordinary people the important critical ways of understanding the complex geographies of everyday life that geographers have and continue to develop. Community geography is also influenced by social critical theorists who were very critical of GIS when it first emerged and became prominent in the geography discipline. John Pickles, who is the editor of an influential book that came out in 1994 called Ground Truth: The Social Implications of Geographic Information Systems. And this book is a seminal text that highlighted the important social consequences of GIS, such as its military background, its surveillance capabilities, and its uneven access. So the social critical theorists were very instrumental in asking GIS practitioners to take a step back and think about the ways in which they use the technology. Who benefits? Who doesn't? Who has access? Who doesn't? What are we doing when we map things like poverty? Are we further socially marginalizing communities by putting deprived communities on a map? There was an immediate backlash to these social critical theorists, though, from GIS practitioners who said that's not always the case. GIS can be used for good. And in fact, GIS is just a tool. And its people, the people that use it, have all the control in the world over how it gets used. So folks like William Craig, Trevor Harris, and Daniel Weiner co-edited a book in 2002 called Community Participation in Geographic Information Systems that showcased a variety of case studies in which GIS practitioners demonstrated the ways that GIS technologies could be used to empower marginalized communities. And so as a research agenda, PPGIS scholars is what they're coined as, public participation GIS or participatory GIS scholars, are concerned about the ways in which people gain access to GIS. And as a practice, GIS practitioners are interested to facilitate access to geospatial tools and technologies. Community geography has also been heavily influenced by movements within universities to be more engaged in the communities within which they're situated. And when community geography was starting at Syracuse, we were honored and privileged to have a university president that was very committed to improving town-gown relationships. Syracuse University has had a tumultuous history with its local community and often is seen as very extractive, going and doing research on the community, getting community members to participate in research projects, primarily on poverty, but the people in the community never seeing any results of those studies and not seeing any difference or change within their communities after having participated. So under the leadership of our former chancellor, we were encouraged to engage in community-engaged research projects with members of our community. And this is a movement that's really spreading throughout many campuses across the United States, and it can often be called engaged scholarship, or community-engaged scholarship, or action scholarship. And it really places an emphasis on universities taking ownership over the situations of the communities within which they're involved. So how does it all work? Well, as a program, I accept applications from members of the local community to help them gain access not only to GIS technologies, but a spatial perspective more broadly, and spatial tools and analytical approaches to advocate for important community concerns, such as hydrofracking, an example I'll get into in a minute, to inform community and neighborhood planning processes, such as delineating safe routes to school for children, supporting community organizing, and an example is around community gardening and urban agriculture, and raising awareness about important community problems and resources. Broadly, we address a number of themes, including health inequalities and disparities, social, environmental, and transportation justice, neighborhood planning and empowerment, and asset-based community development. We're a resource for social service agencies and local nonprofit, grassroots, community-based organizations, neighborhood associations, and faith-based organizations who generally lack the time, the technology, the capacity, and the training to undertake a variety of research projects, but that can benefit from having more empirical evidence for the projects within which they're working. It's a very collaborative endeavor. Students and faculty at SU and other area colleges engage with community geography, as well as our governmental agencies who are often providers of data and who have the power to make change on a policy level. We've created a community steering committee that assists in priority setting and project selection, and that helps encourage relationships across the community. And this is a really unique aspect of the way in which academics traditionally work, and that I have an advisory board that I report to, comprised of members of the community and the university who weigh in on the variety of projects that we work on. And that's a really critical element because it helps make sure that this project and program is not usurped by the university, and that I don't get too caught up in traditional academic pursuits, but that I stay focused and stay true and real to my general audience. So we are responsive in the sense that the community dictates the research agenda. We're inclusive in the sense that anyone who's interested to be involved in our projects are welcome at the table, and transparent. The findings from all of our research projects are posted online into an interactive community map where anyone in the community at large, including our students, can take advantage. We have a pretty simple process that we follow. Community groups submit project requests. Our advisory committee reviews those. And then I work with the different community partners to refine research questions and develop work plans. Typically, the types of project requests I get come from people who can't necessarily articulate what it is they want to do or how they think geography and a geographic perspective can help. But they know that there's something there. So we have to work a little bit and take a little bit of an iterative approach to figuring out exactly the process that we'll take. What are our research questions? From there, we work collaboratively to collect and map data, and then to interpret those maps and results and figure out how we'll act from there. All the results are publicized, and as well as the data sets, so that others can take advantage of the types of analyses that we are producing. And for those of you who are familiar with the nonprofit sector, you'll know that the ways in which our society has neoliberalized, nonprofits are often in competition over funding and will work to seek out that competitive edge with having a little bit extra information or data, and we don't want to feed into that. So we make sure that any of our partners that we're working with are committed to making all of our results publicly available and available to anyone who can use those. And then we evaluate our process and outcomes and try to continuously improve. So I'll give you some examples of some of the projects that we've worked on. When I was first hired, we still continued to work a good deal on food insecurity in Syracuse. As I mentioned, we have very high rates of poverty and food insecurity. And we worked with a number of different organizations, like our senior dining centers, to figure out where we might not have a senior dining center, but high needs for food access among the senior population. We also expanded what we did outside of the city into the suburban and rural areas. As many of you who might be studying sociology know, suburban poverty is also on the rise, and rural poverty is often very neglected. We focus a lot of our efforts on inner city poverty, but we wanted to make sure that we were well aware of what was going on in our suburban and rural communities as well, and we could figure out how to address problems that might be different in terms of access. We also worked with several cities across New York State to replicate the type of work that we were doing, to help them understand, for example, food service program locations for youth during summer programming. And then finally, as increased information became available and the phenomenon of food deserts became more well known, we refined some of our original work using better data, using better techniques, and looking at things like driving distance to the nearest supermarkets in our city and understanding where we still had food deserts remaining. Out of this grew one of my most favorite initiatives that we've been working on now for a decade. In fact, when I go back to Syracuse, our 10th anniversary is Wednesday night. But out of a lot of our research on food insecurity came an interest in urban agriculture and community gardening. We were surprised to learn that Syracuse was very behind many cities in New York as well as across the country in developing community gardening. But yet we had thousands of vacant lots across our city because of depopulation and housing abandonment. And all of these vacant lots are just sitting there and no one's using them. They're collecting trash and debris. Sometimes they're the sites of gang violence. So what could we do to turn those vacant lots into something more productive for our communities? So we created an organization called Syracuse Crows. It's now a not-for-profit, and I serve on the board of that, and I've been on the board of it since its inception, that works with particularly marginalized communities across Syracuse to build community gardens in vacant and abandoned lots. And we work with them to advocate for land acquisition and water acquisition in order to grow these gardens. And we started out with just a few gardens, 2 gardens in 2008, and 10 years later we have 25 gardens and 4 urban farms functioning inside Syracuse, with 2 of those farms on the outskirts. Another example of the types of project we work on involve helping communities to advocate for or resist certain things within our community. And in the early 2010s, there was a big debate over whether or not New York State would allow a new type of oil and gas drilling called hydrofracking in upstate New York. And this map of our county, Onondaga County, of which Syracuse is the county seat, knew little about what types of land leases had been signed by landowners with oil and gas extractors. And right here below Syracuse, to the south of Syracuse, is the Onondaga Nation, where the Haudenosaunee people live. And they were particularly concerned about the potential for hydrofracking in our community. The Haudenosaunee people and the Onondaga Nations have long been stewards of Onondaga Lake and the environment as a whole, and were concerned about the implications and the impact of hydrofracking. And they wanted to know where these oil and gas leases had been signed, but there was no data. There was no information that we could just go down to City Hall and pull up and put on a map. So an advocacy organization called NOON, the Neighbors of the Onondaga Nation, worked with myself and students to painstakingly go through deeds in the county clerk's office and look for every deed that had a lease for oil and gas drilling stapled to it. We recorded those tax ID numbers and then fed them into a map and produced maps that showed that the majority of these leases had been signed in and around the Skaneateles Lake area. Skaneateles Lake is known to be one of the cleanest lakes in the world. It provides unfiltered drinking water to the city of Syracuse. And when people in Onondaga County saw and could visualize the potential impact and the potential consequences to the water system, there was a good deal of public outrage, as you can imagine. The Onondaga Nation territory also was disheartened to learn that there had been leases signed and properties that were adjacent to their property. So with that information, our local officials began to advocate for a moratorium in the county itself until we could learn more about hydrofracking. And then eventually New York State signed a moratorium as well, prohibiting this type of oil and gas drilling. Some of our projects are also very neighborhood focused. We work on a variety of scales, right? From the scale of the county or the region, all the way down to neighborhood blocks. We have some projects where we work with youth and get them involved in being more aware of their neighborhood and mapping what they see as youth as they go through their neighborhoods. So we were working on a project for a good deal of time with schools in the southeast side of Syracuse to understand better the pedestrian and bicycle friendliness of different neighborhoods and the ease or the difficulty with which students could walk to their neighborhood schools. And the information that we collected was really eye-opening, that while city kids in Syracuse are required to provide their own transportation or walk to school if they live within 1.5 miles of the school and they're in elementary school, or within 2 miles if they're in high school, we noticed that there's a lot of challenges that impede their way to school. So we worked with neighborhood organizations and school kids to identify safe routes to school. And those were routes that if you could get to those routes more quickly, you would have safety in numbers. There would be lots of kids walking along those routes. Those routes had the fewest number of pedestrian and bicycle collisions over a significant time period. And then we worked with local law enforcement to increase their patrols during school hours when kids would be walking to and from schools, and had designations put in place for safe routes to school. So as you can see, there's a variety of different types of projects that we've worked on over the last 13 years. In fact, so many that I sometimes laugh and say, what could we possibly map now in our community? Haven't we mapped it all? But they still keep coming up with project ideas. What's most amazing to me about community geography are the students who are involved. There's no staff for this program. It's myself and primarily my undergraduate students who work on these projects. And the program simply wouldn't exist without their assistance. Community geography has engaged students from many different schools and disciplines, so not just geographers, but students who study sociology or photography or anthropology or business are involved in a variety of our projects and bring their skills and assets to the projects that we work on. Through their involvement, students gain exposure to geography and geographic principles and get a better understanding of how they might employ or use the disciplinary training or the academic training that they've had once they're out in the real world. It helps them to think critically about social justice and spatial issues and how space and place matter, particularly in social justice struggles. It helps to expose our students to the city of Syracuse, most of whom aren't from Syracuse and come for their 4-year degrees, stepping little off of campus and getting out into the community. And it provides them with the ability to build portfolios and tangible examples of their work as an undergrad when they're getting ready to apply for graduate programs and apply for jobs. And they learn a lot of soft skills by being involved. So it's not just about learning GIS technology or how to execute a research project, but it's about conflict management and project management, learning how to communicate, as well as facilitate different projects. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an overview of the types of work that we have going on in community geography, and some of it resonates with you, or there's things that you think you might be able to get involved with here through your own studies. I see a lot of opportunities to expand community geography. For one, there's an impact on the communities in which we're involved. We have been able to demonstrate empowerment and the capacity building opportunities for the community partners with which we've worked. We've also been able to create tangible things like a centralized community information system. We've been at this for 13 years now. We've amassed an amazing wealth of data over time as well, so we can study changes in the geography and changes in time of projects and programs that we've been evaluating over the years. It also has many benefits to the university. We see improved university community relationships. This is a project and program that members of the community understand that there's reciprocity, that they're going to gain, and that if they contribute their own resources and sweat equity, that there will be something for them to be gained as well, and that it's not just an extractive research endeavor. And for our students, of course, there's many opportunities for experiential learning. And on the scholarly end of it, I often tell my colleagues, if you're interested to do the most cutting-edge research, you really want to do community-based and participatory research. Oftentimes, the types of challenges that are brought to me by members of the community end up appearing in the national news several years later, because the people on the ground who are working in these challenges day in and day out see what's happening before we, as a society, are more aware of it. I saw that happen time and time again, like with projects with our investigations into access to universal pre-kindergarten or Head Start, where in the very next year, after painstakingly evaluating access to early educational programs, we saw former President Barack Obama speak about those types of programs and the need for them in his State of the Union address. We've also been able to replicate what we've been doing in Syracuse because the process itself, the model, is very flexible and adaptive. There are now several universities in other states across the country who have engaged in community geography programming and started to enroll students in this as well. But what about the challenges? Everything that we do is not without its challenges, right? And I've talked to you mainly about the positive outcomes and the things that we're working on that have benefit to the universities, the students, as well as our community partners. But there's still 3 primary difficulties that are always eating away at me. The first is engaging marginalized community members. It's very difficult to really get into the most marginalized of our neighborhoods and our most marginalized community members and get them to be able to participate in the types of projects we're working on. There's really tangible barriers like lack of access to transportation or childcare to be engaged in projects like this. But then there's also just feelings of disillusion and disempowerment that years and years of racial segregation and isolation in Syracuse have left some people just unwilling to be involved in efforts to change the situation, and I can understand why. And so we're constantly working on ways in which we can improve our ability to engage those who are most marginalized. affecting policy change at multiple scales is also an issue. For something like food insecurity, we've done a number of different analyses at the local level to shed the light on food insecurity and hunger. But at the end of the day, our farm bill and policies made at our federal and state level are in control of how much money people receive in food stamps, for example, or how we subsidize what agricultural crops are grown in our country. And we still have a disconnect in being able to really affect change on major scales. So it's my hope that as we spread this mentality and form more of these partnerships and do more bottom-up and grassroots research, that we'll have more people in numbers and be able to affect policy on wider scales. And then finally, addressing systematic racism and structural inequalities. A good deal of the social justice projects that we work on are rooted in over a century of systematic racism and structural inequality in our country. And it's going to take a good deal of effort to continue to make change in that area. So I'll leave on this note. I can attest from the projects that we've worked on how powerful geography and a geographic perspective, as well as mapping, can be for non-geographers. Geographers and those who study geography possess unique knowledges and skills that are highly valued and sorely needed in many different fields and disciplines. For those of you who are studying geography, you should be proud of what you're studying and understand that your skills and your talents and your knowledge are really in need, and that you'll be in no shortage of being able to lend your gifts and talents. And so for those of you who don't end up necessarily in a field that uses geography in a very overt way, I can guarantee you that there's opportunities to become civically engaged in the communities in which you end up settling. That you can get involved in your neighborhood coalitions, in your local nonprofits, and find and choose causes that matter to you and bring the skills and training that you've received in university and share those gifts and talents with those around you. But at the same time, be open-minded to the gifts and skills that others possess who may not have had the same training as you, but possess knowledges that are equally important. That co-production of knowledge is really important, and I think is what's going to help us with some of our most intractable challenges in the 21st century. So I will leave it there and take questions if anyone has questions. Thank you.
Jonnell, thank you so very much for an insightful presentation concerning community geography, a field still in its infancy, really, and we're fortunate to have you as a pioneer in the field to be speaking about it. I have a question concerning this matter of empowering those that are disempowered. It's an imperative, truly, to empower disenfranchised populations so that there is an interest to become not only an active shareholder in the community, stakeholder in the community, but to be proactive. Do you have any comments or words of advice concerning how that can be facilitated, how that empowerment can be facilitated, especially since this systematic racism has been deeply rooted in our country?
Well, I think it all starts with relationships, right? And getting out of our comfort zone and meeting people and understanding and empathy. I was talking about this with one of your students before we came in tonight, but I think we've lost our way as far as empathy in our country. And when we meet people and we have the ability to develop relationships and listen to different perspectives and hear where people are coming from, we develop empathy. And empathy, I think, is at the root of everything that we do. I mean, as a program, yes, we employ research methodologies, we're using GIS, but it really boils down to reciprocal and trusted relationships.
Trusted relationships indeed, and maybe with a dose of kindness, it'll work wonders.
That's right.
So it's quite obvious from some of the projects you've talked about that the community projects you've developed have come into contact with the political system, right? Especially I'm thinking around fracking and such. And when it comes to coming into contact with fracking and the private sector industry and affecting public policy. What kinds of reception have you gotten, or have you actually seen community members feel more engaged or empowered by having this tool and somewhere to develop it to kind of fight back against those social causes that people often feel disconnected from?
That's a great question, and there's a couple of different answers. Oftentimes, the community members that come to me with a proposal feel like they have tried to get in front of policymakers, for example, and have their voices heard, but oftentimes different activist groups are not let in, that there's a fear that by government that they're going to be either ridiculed or critiqued in ways that they don't want to be. So oftentimes I have been viewed as a neutral party in all of this because I don't have a direct attachment to the activist causes, and that we're using the tools and language that policymakers are more familiar with, right? And we're trying to bridge that communication divide. But also, I'd like to tell community partners as we're embarking on projects that it's important that we involve as early as possible those who have the ability to make or affect change. That we can take on projects and come up with wonderful recommendations, but at the end of the day, if the city government has no interest in undertaking that project or doesn't see it as a priority, then we'll make little progress. So we often try to engage representatives from government in the projects as active participants as well, because their involvement in that process can also be eye-opening for them. They hear, as people are talking and negotiating different projects, what their perspectives are and why it seems like it matters. So I think it's important to engage early on those who have the ability to make change, but also to try to present in neutral ways, and this is really important in today's world with alternative facts, that indeed as much as we can be objective in trying to collect information and data to support claims, we have a better chance of seeing receptiveness to the types of things that we're advocating for.
Hello.
Hello.
So I kind of have a two-part question. First, I was wondering, what courses do you teach at Syracuse? And then these students that are working with you, are they in your courses, or is it an extracurricular thing, or what does that look like?
So good questions. I'll tackle the second question first. So students are engaged in a variety of ways and in ways that make sense to them and their schedules. So I have an internship program. Some of them receive internship for credit. I also pay all of my interns. I am an advocate of them being paid for their labor and their labor being valued. So when students are interested, I will certainly pay them. That said, I do have volunteers who also work that are fulfilling service requirements for another class, for example, and are not able to be paid but need to get their volunteer hours in. And then I teach a few different classes. I teach a community geography class that I kind of invented based upon what we're talking about and what we're doing, where students spend time learning about the theory that informs community geography, and then we engage with community partners on projects in class. I also teach an upper level urban GIS course and a new course for our Master of Public Affairs program on data-driven policymaking. Other questions?
Could you outline food deserts and how they develop and how they look based on comparing and contrasting urban poverty and rural poverty?
Okay, I can try within 60 seconds or less. But that's a really big question. And actually the research on food deserts has shifted tremendously, and now there's more of a critique of food deserts than originally posed. So initially we thought of food deserts as being geographical inaccessibility to healthy and fresh foods. And they were somewhat arbitrarily defined as being about 2 miles in cities, and up to 10 miles in rural areas. Okay, so if you're without a vehicle in a rural area, 10 miles can be daunting, as well as 2 miles in a city. More recent food justice scholars suggest that food deserts are not just about geographic access, right? There's also cultural access, economic access that are influential in determining who does and doesn't have access to healthy and fresh foods. For us, it's at least a starting point to start to take a look at which of our neighborhoods in the city and which towns and communities outside of the city lack some of the most basic access. I worked on a study a couple of years ago with one of my colleagues at SU in food studies on a mobile market. There's now mobile markets in Syracuse that try to serve serve areas that don't have ready access to farmers markets or grocery stores. And in interviewing many of the folks that would go to the mobile market to buy fresh produce, we quickly learned that many of them by hook or by crook could get to the grocery store. But for a variety of reasons, they weren't going to the grocery stores. Most of our stores have moved out to the suburban fringe, and they didn't feel accepted in those grocery stores. We interviewed several members of a senior living facility who lived right across the street from a grocery store, but it didn't matter that that grocery store was right across the street. Because of physical limitations and disabilities, they were unable to even cross the street to the grocery store. So I think our notion of what a food desert is has expanded tremendously in the last several years, and we're more aware of a variety of different barriers that prevent people from accessing fresh foods. Yes?
So obviously these cities don't exist in a vacuum, and sometimes big infrastructure projects happen, like freeway removal and that sort of stuff. Have you ever seen if that kind of radical infrastructure project, like you live in upstate New York, when they removed the inner loop in Rochester, New York, did that have any impact on any of the statistics you were grabbing?
Well, that's a very timely question, because the interstate highway that runs right through our city has outlived its useful lifespan as of 2017. And we have been debating since 2005 what's going to happen to that highway. Will they rebuild the elevated viaduct, or will they knock it down and put in a grade level boulevard and reroute traffic on another interstate highway that already does circumvent the city? And there has been a good deal of political tension around what will happen in our community. And so I've been involved in conversations about what might work best, and I've looked at other cities that they've gotten rid of their highways, and they've seen a tremendous boost to their economic development. They've seen people moving back into the city. They've seen improved housing quality. So I'm hopeful that as our city moves forward and has to come to a decision in the next year or so about what it thinks is best, that we will emerge with a boulevard that runs through our city, and will get rid of that highway that literally divides the university community from our census tracts that are nearly 100% African American and Latino, and that will have better connectivity once again, and the land that gets freed up from getting rid of our highway will be able to be redeveloped and bring in additional business into our economy. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So just a quick question. You were saying that with the history of segregation and everything, sometimes going like outreach to community members is proven slightly difficult. Do you think now that your program has been established for a little bit that it's helping? I mean, do you feel that it's easier?
Yes.
Is it getting better?
Definitely. I do find it easier, and you know, I think along the way we have developed a good coalition of representatives and local community leaders, and we've learned a lot more about different avenues to getting into different communities, working through the churches, for example, and attending neighborhood meetings. So I think we've learned, again, by listening and developing relationships and that trust. There's been a number of occasions where I might be initially viewed with skepticism, but there's someone in the room that says, "Oh, that's Jonnell. She's great. Don't worry about it. You know, she's on our side." So it is interesting that people in the community have very defined perceptions of folks who come from the university in our community. And generally, you know, maybe it's not right, but their preconceived notion is to label that person as on the other side. But I do feel that the program has gained a reputation, and we've gained trust over the last 10 years or so.
Jonnell, last question. Given the great interest today across the country in terms of student activism concerning a number of social issues, do you, and a number of our students here are interested in public school education, especially social studies education, do you see a role for community geography in the public school curriculum, and how might it best be employed, or do you have any suggestions as to how it might be employed?
Yeah, I definitely see a role for it. I have programs myself in both elementary school and high school. I have a Geo Explorers Club in an elementary school, and then I work with some environmental justice classes at the high school level. And I think this is valuable for a few reasons. Those of you who are studying education know that active learning is really important and is on the rise, that as much as we can get kids' hands dirty and get them involved, they're much more receptive to the types of messages that are being taught to them. So I think there's a number of different amazing tools now that are available, anything from, you know, smartphone applications and open source products that are useful in the school setting, and there's curricula that's been developed to help students at a variety of ages start to learn how to map trash, for example, in their neighborhoods. And so along the way, they're learning about why it's important to recycle. They're learning about how to beautify their neighborhoods. They're learning how to use technology. They're learning how to work together. So these types of projects I have found very valuable in teaching students a number of different lessons.
Jonnell, thank you so very much. This has been a great talk.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And for those of you in the audience, if any of you have